All right.
There we go.
I'm trying to like struggle. I was struggling to pronounce your name. Apoke Krummenain, right? Is that your?
Yeah, it's a weird name. So this is one of these
Yeah.
things where I'm just going to own it. It's a self fail, right? So, okay, now you know Charles Haywood, Worthy House, right?
Yeah.
So he does these book report or book reviews, right? And I used to listen to, so you know, your transition from sort of quote unquote normie conservatism into sort of the right wing.
Oh yeah.
I used to listen to, you know, you leave National Review behind and you start going to the American Conservative, and then you discover the American Mind. And then there was like Michael
Vienna Road to American Mind Pipeline.
Yeah. And then so then like Michael Anton is on there, right? And you realize like, oh, this guy, Michael Anton, he's awesome. Like this is the best thing ever. You know what I mean? In conservative fear, right? And then Michael Anton has on this guy, Charles Haywood. And I'm like, oh my word.
Who's really hot, by the way, recently because of his tussle with Rod Dreyer. In fact, me and Prude are going to talk about it on Thursday. His article he did with DC Miller, where he like explicitly calls out Rod.
Oh yeah, he does.
Primitive root wiener guy. So yeah,
it's one of those things where I had posted something on Twitter in defense of this is when I still had my Twitter account, and Mark over at I am 17.
I wanted to ask you about, by the way, but
yeah, Mark over at I am 1776 said, hey, did you want to do a longer write up about that? And I said sure, and then they ended up putting the kill on that and said, you know what, we really should just have Charles on to do it. And I said, well, that's fine, whatever. You know what I mean? Charles is a big boy, he can defend himself, right? Because I tend to agree with him on that idea of no enemies to the right for partly slightly different reasons, perhaps, in that it, by having, I mean, we all recognize there's crazies and weirdos and bad people out.
Oh yeah,
right?
Definitely, 100%.
The more that you cut off the fringes, there's a whole wealth of ideas out there, right? So if you're constantly playing policeman, like as National Review did to paleocons, right? You lose all of these ideas, right? And
yeah, so they fired all the interesting people.
The edge or whatever, but your movement just kind of dies because the vibrant ideas come from the radicals. So if you're constantly policing off the radicals because you're terrified to give them public eye, your movement quickly, well, what does it become, right? Tax cuts. That's it, basically, in the military. And even that's been taken away from them, you know? So
yeah, well, they clipped all the interesting people. They even Mark Stein was like too radical for them, let alone like Derbyshire. Who else did they fire? They fired Derbyshire, I believe.
Buchanan.
Yeah, Buchanan. Or who was the one that D'Souza stabbed in the back personally to get him out of NRO? Was it Derbyshire or was it someone else?
I don't know. But there was a bunch of them that have been, because there was the whole, like, whatever, John Birch Society, all those guys.
Yeah,
gone,
Birchers.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Who were unironically right about everything. Well, not everything.
And they were right about everything. And that's the funny thing, right? So, like, I constantly, like, you know, because I have liberal friends, right? And I, like, you know, you may hate Alex Jones, right? But, like, that dude is right a lot. I'm sorry, but he's a wacko. I mean,
unfortunately, the wrong thing he did like ended in bankruptcy. But that was just like a regime hit piece. Let's face it. That was them trying to bury him.
So it was crazy. Like, and so, So I'm there listening to Michael Anton, and I see this guy Charles Worthy. So I'm in the middle, like what's cold, you know, and my views have been moving like right for a long time, right? But you're trying to find material, right?
Yeah.
So I find Charles Worthy, and he's got, or Charles Haywood, the Worthy House, and he's got all of these book reviews. So I just download his podcasts, right? Because he was reading them at that time. And I'm doing this whole house renovation during COVID. And I listened to like back to back, like 200 of these things. Like seriously, because I would have them on all day while I'm sanding and doing drywall and all the rest of it, right? And then in the meantime, in the intervening time, I'm working or whatever too. But Charles is real good with his time. I started firing emails off to him, offering comments, right? And I don't know whether he got sick of me or whatever.
He might come on the show actually. So
and he would respond and he would write back and then finally one day he says, he says, a lot of the stuff you're saying to me is really good stuff. You should self-publish. right? He says, I could even make some introduction to some guys on the right, you know what I mean? And I said, that would be really good. But he says, you know what, maybe before I do that or whatever, and put in a good word for you, why don't you start publishing on your own? So I got the Substack, right? And I thought,
that's usually how you have to have like a proof of concept. Usually,
that's right. Before they do. So so being clever and smart, right? I outsmarted myself. So I'm trying to think of like, okay, I want to do this anon thing. And I'm very big on this idea of non-rational knowing. Because one of the things that our world does is we get limited to rationality in science, right?
Well, a lot of your work and the people you read are about that too.
That's right.
Well, which we'll get into, obviously.
Yeah. So like the metaphysical, the supernatural, communicate, like, God speaking to you, all of these types of things, right? The spirit world, just intuition, right? So, being a devout Christian, I wanted to end, my degree. I used to be a pastor at one time, right? So, and I mentioned that to people, right? So I can read Greek, my Hebrew is pretty passable. So I thought,
what denomination are you? Anglican or what are you?
No, I'm Dutch Reformed.
Okay, yeah, there's quite a few, because for those who don't know, like
there are.
Yeah, like in certain rural parts of Ontario, there's a lot of. Yeah. But so before I want to describe, like, you're getting to your origin story, but for those who don't know, Kryptos, is that how you pronounce your name? Kryptos?
Kryptos, yeah.
Kryptos, yeah. So we were talking about how you're a Leaf, but then you went to school in Michigan, and you sort of became an American boomer con for a little bit.
For a long time,
which is like most Canadian people who are like right wing in Canada. That's like America's
globalism, no regulations, the whole bit. Right, I went down the full,
like America is by default is like a conservative bastion. If you're like any sort of right winger in Canada, like that's what happened like in the 2010s with like the pipeline, the Ezra Levant, which I mean we could argue if it was AstroTurf, it probably was, but like the Ezra Levant like E-Celeb pipeline was like a thing, right? That for a reason. It's like, why are all these Canadians in the right wing in America? Not even like right wing, a lot of them are right wing, but like, why are all these Canadians in conservatism in America, like Stephen Crowder? I'm like, well, because your only market is like most like I don't like, I'm not like a big like analytics metric guy, but if I were to look, I'm pretty sure like most of my audience is like from America. I mean, a lot of Leafs listen to me as well. Like I get DMs from people who are like Canadians. They're like, wow, I can't believe you're producing this content, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, wow, it's like, that's, but like, I'm weary about like meeting in IRL groups because I'm a full like face lord and it just wouldn't, I didn't even go to the convoys like that. That's how annoyed I was. I
was tempted and I have friends that did. So, Gordon McGill, Gordon McGill and I hit it off, and I have some friends who are truckers. So I understand the industry, and I understand why they were PO'd, and we just couldn't get away. But we were there. We had a lot of friends who went and just said like, "Oh, you missed out. You should have gone." I'm like, "God, don't kill me." You know what I mean? It's just like, so we had a lot of people like sending us pictures, videos, like right from the front lines. And most of what you saw in the media was total crap. It really was.
I just know that like a GeoCell would have been there and would have like, Geo, give me a photograph. I'm like, oh bro, like I would have been, it wouldn't have been nice. But the whole inquiry was like basically just like a Soviet show trial. Like this is what I mean, which we'll get into with Carl Schmitt. Like, if people expecting an outcome that wasn't favorable to Trudeau are just delusional. Like, honestly, like, the way this stuff works.
The only way it wasn't was if it got violent, and the truckers were very careful not to. But they
manufactured things like the Coots thing. They manufactured.
But you think of a truck though, Gio, like a big rig. I mean, those things are like tanks. If those things, if they don't want to move them, they're not getting moved. Like they can run. If they're coordinated and they're not afraid of wrecking their vehicles. Any vehicles that go in there to try to move them, it could have gotten really ugly. If you had like 2,000 trucks downtown Ottawa and those things start bashing around on police vehicles and stuff, like there's no way that a police line is going to stand up to 5 trucks running through them. And so they were very intentionally nonviolent. But the the Canadian government was genuinely scared. And that's why they came down so hard on them. And you could see it. And it was surprising, when you think of Carl Schmitt's the political and what it's been. A lot of people sort of really misunderstand the concept. But Canadians came so close to
realizing it. Yeah.
And to having real politics break out.
Which is another thing that I talk about, like, which I think Americans, like you and me, know this.
Yeah.
But you know from like talking, like I mostly talk to Americans on the show, and they can't get this. They can't get that Canada truly is like a post-political state. So maybe if you have thoughts on that. But before I want to go into that, like you were talking about how your family through Alex Kashuda, and which again another person that found me through Alex. And so
you
were like,
I'm listening to you here, right? And again, knowing like Canada, you relate to this. So I'm sitting here listening to this, right? And I'm like, Geo, and it's like he's from Niagara, and I'm listening to the accent you still have, and I'm like, oh my word, a Canadian Gino. He's like, next thing I know, we're gonna have pictures of him pulling out in a red Firebird. You know what I mean? And I'm just like,
or I'll have a leather. I actually do have a picture with a leather jacket near Niagara Falls, which is funny because the Vaughan. Like, it's not funny. It's terrible what happened in Vaughan. But the guy that the photo they chose of this old Italian guy that went postal that pulled a Niemeyer, a redactozer. I'm like, they had to pick the photo that every single old WAP in Canada had to, like, that came here in the 70s or the 60s. They always have the same photo, the leather jacket next to Niagara Falls. My grandfather has the same, rest in peace, like has the same photo.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and it's
like,
just so funny.
And Canadian. That's like so Ontario, Southern Ontario.
Oh my word. And it's like, and the culture of like late 80s, early 90s Gino culture was just unto itself. It was just like all the guys hanging out at Tim Hortons with their Mustangs and Camaros and Firebirds and stuff. And it's just like, oh my word, do I dare go in to have a coffee with all the Ginos? You know what I mean? And they're all basically trying to look like they came out of West Side Story or something. It's just like,
oh my God. My grandparents actually had a house like 5 minutes away from the falls. So it's like I grew up in the town I grew up like half in Niagara Falls. Well, so
my wife grew up in the Niagara Falls, St. Catharines area. Like they were literally 2 blocks away or something from the Carla Homolka house. Which was,
oh my God. Yeah. Not to dox, but my aunt, she actually worked with Carla Homolka's mother. And she was at the funeral and everything. And that's one thing, like even my own, like even like people ask me like, Gio, why don't you do something about it? Like in terms of your artwork. I'm like, no, it's too literally too close to home.
That's just next level. Like that's next level evil. Like,
I
couldn't even read the stories. Like I would get into the stories and I'm like, I feel polluted and dirty just reading these stories.
I think because it hits so close to home, because I actually have that book that this one journalist at the time wrote that described the snuff film in it. Because apparently they destroyed it, like nobody can see it, but like for obvious reasons. And like it goes into like graphic detail of the trial and everything. And it was like, oh my God.
It's just like that. That is just like next level sicko.
Yeah. It is surreal when you live near it. It's like, oh man, like it's but so
you can still see the property there because they tore the house down.
They tore the house down, but it's still
like nothing else on it, right? So so we have family and friends that live in the Niagara area, so that's why it was kind of fun also to hear you come from.
That's crazy, man.
I know it's like you hear this guy on Alex Kashuda, she's Romanian. I'm like, dude, I live 2 hours away from you. You know, it's just like
this is true multiculturalism. Right here.
I know.
Oh man, but are you? What were you gonna say?
So that was kind of my inroad into sort of
the Geo extended universe.
Yeah.
No, I'm not big enough to say extended universe. It's kind of like like me and Default. We have the joke, the Red Scare extended universe, the Dime Square extended universe. But no, it's funny though. You were we were talking and you were saying like how but are you like what you would consider like founding stock Canadian? I guess. I mean, that's not like a concept in Canada.
I'm a second generation immigrant, so it's
okay.
It's in that regard. And being part of the, like, and I'm probably getting close to outing myself, but being part of the Dutch Reformed community, yeah, and I tell people this, I'm part of an immigrant group. Like, we're tall, blonde, and white, and which is why for me, white is not a concept that really makes a lot of sense to me, because I live by the old saying, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, right? And so we went back to the Netherlands. Yeah, we went back to Netherlands this summer, and just it reminded me again that there's a wound that gets created with immigration, where you're pulled from your spiritual home. This is sort of that something that binds you together. It's both genetic and spiritual or whatever. But like, I go back to Netherlands and all the architecture looks right. The people look right. They sound right. Just not even the language, but just the tone of voice. Like when I'm in the mall, I can pick a Dutchman out of the crowd talking, like, oh, they're Dutch, right? Because there's just something about the tone of voice. But you go to the Netherlands and all of a sudden, like, you can't pick your wife out of the crowd if you get separated, because everybody sounds the same.
Yeah.
And so it's like going to church, but like everybody's around you. So all the girls look the right, like, because I'm tall, right?
They don't look transmogrified yet.
Yeah, but everybody is just like, all the girls look like they're supposed to look, right? All the guys look like they're supposed. It's so funny, and every old lady looks like a Dutch grandmother from church. It's just hilarious. And so like I step off the plane and I could feel at home there. So here, like, I mean, not that I don't feel at home in Canada in some sense, but it's not the same thing. So I love the North. I love canoeing. I love fishing. But as far as like what is a Canadian, like I suppose, like, I mean, if you do a Google search of Ontario, right, the history of Ontario, like, you think to yourself, well, what is a Canadian? Well, probably the closest thing you would come to a Canadian is like the early French settlers, going back as early as some of the American settlers, or maybe like somebody in Nova Scotia, because the second North American colony after Virginia was in Nova Scotia, like by a couple of years. Okay, so those folks can really claim like a North American culture, and that's why you get like real living culture in Canada. It all comes from the East Coast, like East Coast music, East Coast, like, right? So, or Quebec culture. But you come to Ontario, like the first settlers in Ontario were Americans who were fleeing this, like the Revolutionary War. They were loyalists, and they came and they settled in Ontario. And you're like, okay, other than that, there was trapping stations and fur trading outposts, but there wasn't really settlements. Settlements were like 5,000 Americans.
For the longest time, we were like the most emphatic, like, British loyalists. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Anglo culture was like even up into the Trudeau era. But people don't know, I mean like Trudeau Senior, Pierre. Like, my old man still, like, this is why I say like he's a big Anglophile, because he, even though him being like descendant of Italian immigrants, and like me, I'm a descendant of a direct Ellis Islander immigrant, Italian immigrant, but like, he still remembers a Canada that was still like a part of a cultural awareness of their British roots. And here in Anglophone Canada, I mean, Quebec, obviously, like, even like he would say, like, we recently started watching the Leafs again, even though that's kind of blackpilling. He was saying, like, back in the day when the Leafs played the Canadians, like, the teams had a farm system. It wasn't like now, where like half the players in the Canadians are pretty much from Ontario or elsewhere. Like, back in the day, like, they actually were Quebecois, like Rocket Richard, right. And and he's like, that's why like every like game in the what's the historic arena they played in? What's it called?
Oh, the Forum.
The Forum, was incredibly violent. The fans were actually harsher on the Canadians than they were on the other team. Like,
it's brutal.
Like, they're brutal, those fans. Like, they don't even cheer.
Word. The old Gardens or something else too.
Yeah, the old Gardens. Yeah, like I was rewatching the 93 game with the part where it was against the Kings, where they screwed over Gilmore.
Yeah. Oh, my word. I stopped watching because that was my first year in Michigan. And with that game that I stopped watching hockey. I said, I can't do this anymore. And
then Pat Burns wanted to like fight for the coach. It was hilarious because it was when when McSorley just like blasted Gilmore in the face right in the middle of the garden, and then Clark just comes up and pounds him. Like, you knew it was gonna happen. Like, you can't like go and blast a captain in the face like that. It's just like, you know. But that was
I actually went to the first game where Montreal played in Toronto.
Man,
after Burns became coach. And remember when he went across the ice with his little fist pump? And I was just like, because they hosed him in Montreal and turfed him out, and we picked him up here in Toronto. And that was like, those were the days. I mean, the Garden, and that's the funny thing about the Gardens, and you think of the shift culturally, right? Between like Canadian culture and this sort of globalist technocracy, right?
Exactly,
The Gardens was a working class place. Like,
very much so. Yeah,
regular job, like lunch bucket guys watching hockey. I mean,
it was built like slapdash.
And it was, and when you watched hockey in there, like you could shout stuff back and forth to the other side of the ice and stuff. And when guys went shoot, you know, you heard it, like little old ladies like yelling shoot from the other side of the arena. And it
was more intimate than like now. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And so now it's all just corporate and it's PMCs and like whatever.
Bro, you know, I couldn't believe it.
Like, but like what? Yeah.
It was crazy. Like I was watching, and you know, the one thing like that's like literally again, like this is, if anything, you want to talk about Americanization, like that's a good symptom of like the, you know, Gary Bettman regime. Like they discourage fighting. The refs like immediately go in there as soon as you start like a brawl, and it's just like, bro, like I remember back in the day, like when I was a kid watching like Ty Domi just like wreck people like that. He was my favorite player. I actually had a Ty Domi jersey.
Tiger Williams, man. I remember Tiger Williams.
Yeah. You're like Probert or like McSorley. Like McSorley was just like a psycho. Like for those who don't know, like that's how Gretzky became a great, because you needed a guy like McSorley to like tune people up, because
he was
like,
an enforcer.
Yeah, like
what he did. Like,
that was the role of the goon. Like people don't know this nowadays. Like,
you hit our star player a little too hard.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, you're bleeding on the ice. That's just the way it is.
It was like a mafiatic type of scenario. Like it was like, you knew that if you tried to harass Gretzky, that McSorley was gonna come and just
just the code.
That's what it was. Yeah. Like nowadays, like these young guys, they don't get it. Like they okay, understand like the rules about like you know, like trying to extend the game. Like, you know, like I mean, they have cut down on like
and concussions. I get some of this stuff.
Yeah,
but, that's good.
Yeah, but like, come on, no fighting, no goons, and of course, like you know that, like the NHL, they like caved the knee to like the BLM and the tweeting out like trans women or women and stuff. Like it's
I know it's brutal.
It's not
but
good,
still,
man.
You know, like you can still like laugh and joke, like because it's a winter sport, right? So you know, like we Canadians all love the Winter Olympics, and I always joke with my wife and family, you know, it's the white guys Olympics, you know, and
yeah,
you know, you still look at I mean, like Subban and so forth, right? But it's still like it's a white guy sport.
It's overwhelmingly a white person sport.
It just and it's nothing, but there is. I mean, I know there's some Canadians who've gone south to California who started high school hockey leagues and stuff out there, and it's really getting big, and so there is getting some color integration there as well. But I mean, like, what is hockey? It's just like lunch bucket guys taking their kids to the arena, and this is your shot to escape having to go work at 4, you know?
Like,
and
literally.
That's how it works.
My grandfather, he was he was a foreman for one of the largest brick companies in North America. Like if you Google my name, some of it will come up but unfortunately, like there's no records of it because they went bankrupt in the huge like early 80s crash, right?
Yeah.
So they were called General Concrete, and he actually like I believe had like NHL players like basically work in the summer while they were on the off season with him. Like he was their manager, and he remembers like literally like hockey was a working class thing. And I feel like hockey is another like indicative sign of like I guess you could say like a certain form of like soy progressive refinement culture that it's like indicative of Reddit. Like for example, pro wrestling was very similar in that it was like a working class man's like basically theater of violence. But now it's like this again, like it becomes like the soy jack Reddit, like it's got about 1 million moves and acrobatics. It's no longer like about like it's working class origins, similar to hockey, similar to like comic books. It's like now it's like Reddit, you know what I mean? Like
yeah. So like now, if you want to watch like working class hockey, you got to watch the OHL. You know, like London Knights, Kitchener Rangers, that type of thing. Because there you get guys who like have real jobs, who can buy season tickets, right? And the product is amazingly good, and the Knights are good.
Oh, wow.
Right? So you can go down and like I think the stadium seats like 7,000, something like that. And so it's it used to be the John Labatt Center, but it's now the Budweiser Center. I still can't wrap my head around the name change. But I mean, Labatt is a big London company, right? They basically, I mean, Budweiser is a Labatt brand, so they just basically, I guess, wanted to push Budweiser. So all of a sudden, the John Labatt Center became the Budweiser Center because the Labatt family decided that Budweiser needed to be pushed, right? But it's but that's really where you get more of the lunch bucket hockey, and you still get a lot of, like, if you look at the kind of families that take their kids to play hockey, most of them are working class. Like that is still really like the aspirant working class sport.
In America, it's like to become like part of the, you know, to play football. In Canada, very much is like the working class dream of like you're good enough at hockey that you'll go to like, you know, Pee Wee, then you'll go up to like a junior B, then eventually the OHL, and then you'll go to the, you know, then you'll play for the Leafs one day. Like that's the dream. But
it is the dream to play for. Like I mean, who else? I mean, like really, what other team would you play for? Right? That's kind of the.
Well, it depends. Like the Canadians were more like certainly, like back. It depends what era. Like in the like in the 80s, they were more popular because they kept like winning. But then the Leafs are like the number one brand. Like if the salary caps didn't exist, the Leafs could have like
everybody.
Like, they could have like a giga-chatted team. Like no,
it doesn't matter. They like people have done the based on the interest in hockey in Toronto. You could probably run 3 pro teams in Toronto.
Oh yeah, but of course, like you can't have that because you know because of Gary Bettman. But that's the thing. Like for some reason, they're just cursed. Like it doesn't matter who they have. Like you know, it just for some reason the Leafs. You know, the curse is real. But
the curse is real. They I'll tell you this. They won their last Stanley Cup a couple of months before I was born, and then they it's my fault.
See, that's why that's why the gripers kept calling you a boomer on Twitter.
That's right. Yeah, they did because I am. It's so funny because I am about 4 or 5 years inside of Gen X, so you kind of like boomer adjacent, but there is a real dividing line. Like somebody who was born 5 or 6 years before me. There's a difference to them. Like, you know, I hit my 20s when Nirvana was, you know, me and
so you're like core Gen Xer.
Yeah, and exactly. So they don't do, you know, the guys who are born 5 or 6 years ahead of me, they don't really do Pearl Jam and
no, they're like more of my old man's generation who's like a late boomer. Right. Yeah.
And they're still doing like Led Zeppelin and all that kind of stuff, right? And
so, Leonard Skinner, progressive rock. Yeah.
And the other thing too is growing up, like I'm a big John Hughes nut. Like I have everything he's done on DVD. So, you know, like Breakfast Club, like that captured the ethos of who we are. That was what school was like. You know what I mean?
I feel Zoomers don't have that. Like, for example, like us, like, okay, the Gen Xers, I was talking about this with, you know, Billy Pratt, right?
Yeah.
Bad boy Billy Pratt. Because I'm trying to get him to come on the show, but then he's like, oh, Gio, I need to buy a microphone. I'm like, bro, you had one. Like, what happened? Because he used to come on Follow the Rules all the time. So, but we were talking about this about like iconic movies, and I think he said like Breakfast Club because he's also like a core Gen Xer. So I'm like, he's like Breakfast Club, maybe Heathers, and I'm like, bro, for us like core millennials, like I'm Gen Y, like I just turned 30 in December, and like I'm like that core millennial, like the mini baby boom that happened in '92. So I'm like, bro, for us it was like Mean Girls. Yeah, like Mean Girls is literally like
Low-end. Oh man,
yeah, it's so like sad. The defining millennial movie.
Well, see, and the other big one is, and people don't realize this, Star Wars, right? Okay,
we could say that was like the Gen X audience.
I was 9 when Star Wars hit the theaters. Like you people don't realize when, like, because now it's old hat special effects and stuff.
Yeah,
when that hit, like I was like 9
Speaking
years
of the Redditification,
like, mind blowing. Like this movie was absolutely mind blowing.
Yeah,
and people have no idea the effect it had. Like movies were different after that. Nobody, because you think like the sci-fi movies done just before that, like Rollerball.
Oh yeah, the classic Rollerball, not the millennial remake with Slipknot.
It was only a couple years before Star Wars.
Did you ever watch the remake of Rollerball?
Sorry, did I watch which one?
The remake of Rollerball?
No, I couldn't.
It had like it had.
No, it was not. No, the original Rollerball was just that film was different, and the opening with the organ music and stuff, and that movie was like, I showed that to my son. He's kind of like, this is a weird film, Dad, and I'm going, but yeah. You look at it and you think of how many things they call in terms of like corporatism and
well, same with Blade Runner. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's a phenomenal film that people should watch. You should own a copy.
It's funny because like the remake is like the total like older millennial chud type of stuff, because it had like Paul Heyman in it. It had like from WWE. It had ECW. It was like right after he sold ECW to Vince, and it had like Slipknot in it. Like it was crazy.
Yeah, it was just they're just cashing in, and it lacked the authenticity of Well, and it was still a day when like individualism could still be a thing, where the heroic individual spirit could triumph over the adversity of the communists or the corporatists, you know?
Yeah.
Nowadays you never see films like that anymore. Where
there was the last gasp, I would argue, would be like, and it's funny because this is like Sam Chris's point that he wrote, even though like, you know, he's an irony leftist, whatever. But like he wrote this article where he talked about the new Matrix film, and he said like there was this moment like right around like the late 90s where there was a bunch of films and culture where you could like potentially critique the way things were heading to where it was like, you know, the Matrix. It was before that, it was Existence, which is, I would argue, the better film. And there was like a bunch of series, and it was like, you know, even like something like a cartoon like Duckman had like the critique of like that particular moment in culture, like right before the internet. But then as time goes on, it becomes like, what did he say? It becomes no longer like, you know, fight the system or like critique it, or like all of this is unreal. Now it's like listen and believe. And like media is like pop culture industry media is now like the delivery system of you know, by POC, GAE
it's full propaganda. It's full propaganda all the time.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting. Maybe the last really good film like that heroics individual spirit film that is Gattaca. I don't know if you've ever seen.
Yeah,
Gattaca.
I love Gattaca. That's like
Gattaca
unironically, like
the contrast between the two brothers, the one that was engineered and the one that was born naturally. And the one that's born naturally, you know, like his engineered brother could never figure out, like, how could you beat me at swimming? And he says, well, I just never saved anything for the trip back, you know. And you're like that kind of, you know, try hard versus, you know, born into it, right? And like, do you ever see anything now with that kind of, like, you never see that anywhere.
Maybe if they had a film where they CRISPR a trans woman into real. Never mind. But like, you know what's funny though is I remember you had this take about it's probably because of Gattaca. Like, it's funny because like I grew up like in a Star Trek household. My old man watched the original Star Trek. He never watched Star Wars, so like I watched Star Trek. Even though you could argue that at least like, you know, Star Trek always was kind of like global progressive propaganda.
It was absolutely
100%. But like, it's funny, you had this take about eugenics that like just like the Amarnites and like a lot of people like just like, oh, you're just an old boomer. And it was funny because I think like you were thinking of Gattaca because you'd figure like there is a section of the right wing that is like more pro like engineering and futurism and eugenics and
well, it's interesting because and this is one of these, like, again, there was an Oren McIntyre piece today, right? About,
I'm going to go on Oren tonight, actually, at the time we're recording.
Oh, well, nice. Yeah. So I'm reading this piece, and he's like, well, the woke teach something, content, right? And you can't go back to a neutral space. And I think Oren doesn't carry it far enough in a sense of like, well, if you're going to teach something, what would you teach as positive content? Like, what is an American? Like, and what does it mean to be like core American? Like, what is the belief system? So you could argue, because like as late as Rush, you would still have things like, well, we got to be against the environmentalists because they want to kill capitalism, right? Yeah. So we just got to trust that, because there's a profit motive, scientists are going to come up with solutions to all of our environmental problems because somebody's going to make money off it.
That's like the Normie Khan approach.
Like, dude, this was like 15 years ago or 10 years ago. This was conservatism, it was basically techno-optimism. And you're going like,
it was like James Dellingpool.
Yeah. And so you're like, I don't know, you like, what would you say to people? Like, how would you describe a class? Like, what would be the positive American content that you would teach? There's one of the reasons why my kids go to a private Christian school is because as a devout believer, we have a really clear sense of what our positive content is, right? Mm-hmm. And we're quite comfortable living as a separate community apart from the mainstream culture. And I have no problem with the idea of indoctrinating my kids into what I believe, because that's what you do. But as far as like American or Canadian, even public education, the people on the left understand this, that it's an educational dictatorship. But the people on the right are very uncomfortable. So then if on the right you want to teach positive content, what are you going to teach? Like, I don't think anybody on the right really even knows what they're going to, like, what they would teach. And people say, well, we've gone too far.
We have to go back to the
start tracking
90s liberalism.
You go, right?
Yeah.
Putting women in the factories during World War II because the men were off fighting. Well, what did you think was going to happen then? During total war. Well, all these women liked working and being independent while their guys were away fighting the war.
Then they hated it after, but then now they have no choice. The girl boss is like the schizophrenic entity when you think about it.
Well, and you think of like global free trade. So first there was NAFTA and getting rid of the auto pack. It's like you talk auto pack and people are like, what's the auto pack, right? So like I know what when you talk about opening up like labor force, right? So labor is a supply and demand thing, and people don't really think about it, right? So okay, you've got a pool. It's only men who are working and doing most of the work, right? And then you open up all that pool to women. So now you add in North America like 100,000 or 100 million women or whatever it is into the workforce. Well, what do you think is when you have an increase of workforce of 100,000 or 100 million people into the workforce, right? Well, the value of an individual worker goes down. And then you start talking about global trade. Now you add, 400 million people in China, 500 million workers in China into your working pool. Well, your wages are going to continue to go down, right? So
it's so over. Yeah.
Right. So you're thinking like, who is really benefiting? So then you realize like people who were conservative were quote unquote conservatives were telling this, but then what were they conserving? Well, really in the end, they were conserving the power of big business. So then when somebody like say Carl Schmitt says that, well, America's not really a state. It's more like an economic cooperative masquerading as a country. You go like the light bulbs go off and you go like, duh, he's right. It isn't a country. It's just an economic cooperative. Because when you come down, because Carl Schmitt, you talk about friend enemy again, right? Well, who is the friend? Well, it has a partly ethnic component, but Carl Schmitt basically comes down. It is those people that you would die for, or maybe more importantly, that you would kill. And so he says it's not about hating anybody, but when you get up to the level of the state is there to, in a sense, protect the friend, the people. So in a sense, the state is there to die for us in some sense, to fight for us in a way. And generally that's supposed to be an external enemy, right? Mm-hmm. But it's supposed to be looking after issues. But if your most important criteria is economic, you don't really have a state because you're not fighting for anybody. And that's the whole thing of like, well, it's about the economy, stupid. Well, if it's about the economy, stupid, it isn't about Americans. I can tell you this, or Canadians. It's about corporations and it's about business, right? So you don't have a country. You basically have an economic cooperative masquerading as a country. So in the sense then, how do you subordinate the economic to the demands of things? Well, people say, well, that would kill your standard of living. Well, maybe it would, but okay, so you don't have as much devices or whatever, but
and the green line doesn't go up all the way.
Yeah,
so,
everybody and his brother has a decent job. Like, you remember what it was in the 80s and 90s, and everybody worked at Ford, and they all had their Harley and their little, like, their side split and stuff.
It's all paper mills down here, yeah.
Well, yeah, but everything was, maybe it wasn't quite as, the average size house was 1,500 square feet or smaller, right? But it was a good life. And you worked until you were 60, you retired, you had your Harley, and then you did a little traveling. And that was it.
To the boomer tree, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You became a snowbird. You went to Florida every year.
Yeah. But like everybody you knew was like, like for where I grew up in Toronto, everybody that you knew somebody who worked at Ford.
Oh yeah.
Right? At GM in Oshawa.
Yeah, my uncles all worked at GM. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So it's and that was kind of the way that was. And then like a good life was if you had somebody who worked at Ford and they could get you in, right?
Yeah, that was the big thing. Yeah.
You were set, right? So but then NAFTA did all of that in, global free trade with China did all of that in. And
it was all over.
Yeah.
It was over.
And so, like and people bristle at these ideas, but like from so it comes back to that Oren question. Well, you've got to teach something. Well, what in the world does the right wing teach? What does it mean to even be right wing anymore? I think the concept is almost meaningless at this point. It's
there was two points because I wanted to bring in like the thing about Schmitt, and what people like getting Americans to understand that Canada truly is like a post-political place, but there was one thing about like a lot of people give Oren flack, they say like he's a grifter and all that, but like he's much more of like our guy behind the scenes. But I understand like if you have like a semi-normie media job, then
he's careful. And
he has to be
people
careful.
Want him to be like me. I'm I'm always worried that I'm going to say the one thing somebody will out me or whatever. And I look back, it's like, okay, my written stuff is not that terrible, but I mean, I'm not afraid to say some stuff.
Yeah, I'm not afraid to say a lot of things.
Actually, Oren is careful, and that's fine. You know what I mean?
But there was one thing I remember. I said this example before, like on the show, and elsewhere. There was this one point where I believe it was Ann Coulter that had this tweet about that certain event that happened in like, what is it, 2 years or a year ago now, that happened in January. You know the one, I can't say it for YouTube, but Ann Coulter like literally like it was such a dumbass like normie-com point where she said on Twitter, she's like, well, is that what the lesson that they learned? That the left has to basically just criminalize their opposition forever? And then Oren quotes are saying, yes, exactly, that's what they learned. That's exactly the lesson they like. If you don't get that by now, and again, it was a very Schmittian point, like from his Oren's, reading of Schmidt, and it's like that's exactly the lesson they learned. Yes, they're going to criminalize the opposition. Exactly. Like, if you haven't learned that by now, I'm sorry, you're done. Like,
but and look
at the truckers too. They basically criminalized their opposition. That's what Trudeau did. And Trudeau has technically a minority government, but he still did it anyways. So it's like,
like when you read Schmitt, like there's the stuff that you look around like Canada and you just pull your hair out, right?
Yeah.
Because like Schmitt will say things like, and I actually made a couple notes, right? The will of the minority is in truth identical with the will of the majority.
Yeah.
Right. Because in a voting system, if you talk about the will of the people, once you reach 50% plus one, that's it. So the minority has no voice. So effectively,
here it's 30% plus one in Canada.
Yeah, yours good. Now, so then you explain it to people. So in this piece that I wrote on this one, I said it's even worse in Canada because no government is at a majority of the vote. You can win a majority of the seats. I mean, technically, you can do it if the math breaks totally perfectly. You can win a majority government with 17% of the vote.
Yeah, if some crazy alchemy happens, but it's happened before. Yeah.
But like the Liberals have got, what, 35% of the vote? So effectively, now I understand that Canada is more left-wing. So if you combine, say, the Bloc, which is generally socialist, and you combine the Liberals and you combine the NDP, it makes up about 65% of the population, right? But even so, though, the Liberal agenda, like they're setting a majority government, is that with 35% of the people, So those 35% of the people effectively becomes the will of the people. Yeah. And so once they're in power, I mean, you can whine and moan and object and be in the opposition all you want, but effectively, you're all now liberals until they get voted out, right? And that's the crazy thing about it.
Yeah.
And then once you're voted into power, and this is the thing that Schmitt noted, is that it's almost irresponsible as a winning party not to try to game the system to produce a uniparty type of state like California. So so you talk about your liberal friends and they're like, wow, there was no cheating. And I said, well, there doesn't have to be cheating in the election because they've gamed the system legally such that they don't need to cheat anymore. And that's the point of being in power. And the point of standing up to them is to then try to game the system the other way. And you're like, well, yeah, what about gerrymandering in Republican districts? Well, yeah, the Republicans do it because that's what you do when you're in
That's
power.
like the only tool that Republicans have really in America. And they've the liberal media freaks out about it. But literally it's the only tool that Republicans have. Like they don't have the same
or voting integrity. You're a racist if trying to demand voting integrity.
I think it's a product of British managerialism, I feel.
Yeah, well, and the funny thing is that even though America gets knocked for being very hostile to immigration, Canada actually has a more stringent immigration system than the Americans do. We just set higher quotas. So, so even though that's stringent, there's still a lot of people out there who meet those requirements.
Yeah, unfortunately, Justin's just bringing them in, but
and it's
in an ideal case, we have a better system.
Yeah, and the thing is though too is the people that they're bringing in are aspirant technocrats from all around the world. So, you say, it's a post-political system, but all of the people here, they do bring their own culture because I know cultural way of doing things. Yeah, and I think people are going to wake up one day and find that Canada.
It's not too shocking of a point, but in Canada it is. But it shouldn't be a shocking point. That is the truth,
that is. Yeah. And so you have a whole class of people who are basically aspirant technocrats. They all want to be engineers, lawyers, doctors, dentists, what's going to happen if there's a significant economic downturn, right? Are they all going to go to the next hotspot for aspirant immigrants? I don't know. Are they really going to become quote unquote Canadians? What does that even mean? I don't know if anybody even knows what a Canadian is anymore. I mean, definitely ever since the culture has eroded, and you can still go out into rural Ontario here and you can find Canadians. Yeah. Right. But if you're in a city, there's no such thing as a Canadian. If you've got say over 100,000 people, there are no Canadians anymore in a city. They're all basically global homogenized aspirants of some sort or whatever. It's brutal.
Yeah, Canada is again, Britain, London, I believe, is 40%, not even 40% British, but the Little Englanders are still largely, I mean, they're not in a good shape, but
no,
especially the young people. But here in Canada, if you go to outside of the metropolis cities, you'll still find quote unquote heritage Canadians or us European immigrants, right? So
if you got a small town with a curling arena, you've hit Canada.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Yeah.
But you think to yourself, well, it's comforting. Am I afraid of it? I'm not really afraid of it or whatever. I'm smart enough to look and see what's going on and realize that I'm not sure, they're playing with fire, right? I'm not sure.
Maybe you have to splice into Jonathan Bowden, add it in this, this is what they took from you in your own country.
Well, no, but it's not that though. Okay, so we take it from a philosophical perspective, right? So again, you come back to Schmitt and his idea of a unitary culture, right? That you can't really get the will of the people, he argues, unless you have a unified society. And somebody says, well, how can you have a democracy in a unified society? And I said, well, here's how the way it works is that there's no true divided society that way. So what happens is you have any social group, you go in and everybody kind of knows what the unspoken rules are, what should be said, what shouldn't be said, what you can do, what you can't do. And so within that unspoken culture and the unspoken rules, everybody operates freely within that set of fences. So all debates then happen within that unified cultural context, right? So everybody understands the rules. We understand how we resolve differences and so forth. But now you get two groups, like in the United States. So now you have, say, two views of the Constitution. Well, you can appeal to the Constitution, but are you even appealing to the same document? Right? That type of
double
thing.
American thing
that's exactly it. So you get outside of, and you could say, well, we'll look at the Bible. That could be the answer. But so once you get outside of a unified context, and you don't have this shared culture, and you get real disputes about how do you resolve this? Well, take, for example, Sharia law versus Western law based on the Roman legal tradition, right? And you have a conflict between those two laws. You have two different cultural histories. How do you resolve that conflict? Like what rules, like what authority do you go to decide a conflict between two culture groups? And eventually Schmitt says that what happens is well, I mean, I guess either you realize you're both strong enough to withstand the other, and so you kind of you live with each other like side by side as a friend enemy, or one of you wipes out the other one, and so you end up with an armed conflict. A conflict of some sort. So one must dominate the other, so that you have a shared set of rules, unspoken, and so you know how to resolve conflicts. And what we're getting in a sort of a multicultural world, by bashing all these cultures together and assuming that they're all the same as long as we're technocratic aspirants, is that what is the system? If it's all pragmatic, but what happens when you come to a real conflict of values? How do you resolve that conflict of values? How do you determine who is right? Well, it basically comes down to the will to power. And that's basically what the culture war is right now, is that the global technocratic left is just simply asserting its will to power. They're creating a unified society. That's what they're doing through the culture war. They're basically destroying every other culture in its wake. And like my most recent Substack piece argues that the culture or the group that is most threatening to the left is active, vibrant Christians. And why is this? It's because they believe in a metaphysical moral order. In a sense, they have a moral standard by which they can judge your behavior. So it isn't simply the will to power. There's, in a sense, thus says the Lord, right? Or God created the universe with a moral fabric that underlies everything. And so in a sense, we can, if you can see this moral order, like you are a seer or an authority on it, a wise man, you can make a pronouncement based on, well, this is how God has made the creation, right? So you appeal to the wise man within the Christian tradition, and he looks at the word of God, he prays about it, and he says, this is what we should do, right? And everybody then accepts that settles the dispute. And so people know how to act and they know what to believe, right? And they have a standard. Well, you can't do that because it violates God's law. Well, the secularists or the sexual revolutionaries, with a very completely different moral system based on, if it feels good, do it. You run into this. You're in a sense a constant reminder that what you're doing is immoral. So the big threat, the big threat to the left is not the a-religious right. It's not even the politically religious, where politics becomes more important than the faith, but it really is like active Christians. So you're going almost back to those old New Testament days where you live as a separate community within, say, the Roman Empire, and you face persecution, or you might have to do the hard thing and defend yourself with weapons.
Or the Soviet Union church is going underground, and
that's exactly China. You know what I mean?
China,
and so that I think is really, but the group, and this is the philosopher Augusto Del Noce that Carlo Lancelotti, and the tremendous service he did in translating Del Noce. Is Del Noce was saying these things in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that this is where it is going, and this is what the left wants to do. And really and he identified it right away. He says the response to it is not politics, because they're not afraid of losing political battles if they win the cultural battle. The response to it is to have an active, to really believe in the transcendent, and to really believe in the supernatural, that there is a supernatural, metaphysical, immutable moral order out there. Because that's the thing that the left fears, is people who believe this kind of stuff and live it with integrity.
Well, even their appropriation of certain faiths, that they wear as a skin suit, whether it be woke, neoliberal version of Islam, where it's basically the mostly that term hijabi, right? It's mostly just an identity issue to be first of all, they've abandoned like Islam. I feel like that was much like of an early 2000s thing because of the war. But even like these more like newer age faiths, I feel like the Zoomers, for instance, they are like adverse to the anti-metaphysical, like ironic detachment, like fedora tipping atheism of like the core millennials, right? Like the ironically detached, like Jon Stewart, Richard Dawkins. You know, like the classically atheist YouTube, right? So they don't have that. They have much more of a like, you could say almost like a mystical form of thinking that I think the political left had to adapt. But they'll like, you know that term selective nihilism.
Yes.
They'll still revert to selective nihilism when it comes to like the enemy of Christianity, where they'll still like revert, even though they'll like entertain like baby witches or whatever, they'll still like revert to selective nihilism when it comes to Christianity. And then they'll make like your typical like early, like, you know, mid 2000s, like new atheist arguments, which are like ridiculous. But
the thing is their mysticism and their spiritualism is still all rooted in,
it's very counter-initiatory.
Well, and it's very much rooted in like my own feelings of what's out there. They're not believing in an immutable order, in a sense, a creator God to whom you are accountable to. Yeah. Right. And that's really the thing that because you get like a lot of these like philosophies that we have to deal with. For example, say evolutionism, right? Mm-hmm. Well, you know, like evolution is both terrible philosophy and terrible science, right? So there you come down to origin stories, right? So like Genesis is like your origin myth for Christians, right? Well, you have an origin story. So if you assume that there is no God and the world is materialist, it's atheist, you ask the question of how do we get here? What's the story of our arrival? So then the story of the arrival is then progress. So you start with a singularity, it explodes, and then from there, you know, boom, 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 matter collides, and it just
out of nothing came everything.
But it's all this, and so progress.
Lawrence Krauss, the world from nothing, even though he was on the flight logs. But
so in the sense, it's an origin story. It's a religious belief as much as it is science, and so you've basically already decided what the story is, and now you're looking to go out and make the data fit the story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so they do this all the time. Like this is like the Big Bang, and this is everything. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm quite comfortable being, say, a short day creationist in a sense because, like, nobody has extra universes around in which to do spare tests on it and so forth. What do you do? But in a sense, if you look back at the stories, these stories emerge from kind of prehistory. And so the stories are meant to tell us as much about the way things are as they are to give us a videotape of what happened. And so if the stories tell us this is the way things are, I'm quite comfortable like talking in 6-day creationist terms because I don't really care about the question of evolution or whatever. And that's kind of part of a lot of arguing with leftists and to drive them absolutely crazy is just not to play the game. It's like, well, I don't accept the premise of your argument. Like, I don't accept the premise of where you're coming from. Like, I don't even want to talk about, like, well, what about evolution and how it matches up to the data? I said, well, it's irrelevant, right? You can go knock yourself out and have fun with that, but it really doesn't matter. And then, well, what do you mean it doesn't matter?
Yeah, like I was caught up at the time back in the day, like with what if it's theistic evolution? Now I just basically don't like to entertain like any sort of like. It's like what Oren says about like as soon as you start debating over like drag time story hour, then that's over. Like it's like even
the presence, the premise of their story.
Like, it's worthy of debate.
What's the right place for trans people to like? What's their right place in society? Well, at that point, you've already accepted the fact that they're okay. Then it doesn't matter. Like you've accepted the premises of their argument.
Yeah, but I think we should go back though to like the sort of core paradox that's at the heart of Schmitt, because it's funny. Like I was reading your Schmitt articles and I was rereading the one you did on Jacques Ellul. And it seems that they both come to the conclusion that secularization that happened from the Reformation onwards is basically what has directed people into the paradox of democracy in the sense of like, okay, democracy is like the sovereign becomes the people, but then who decides in the state of exception? Go through like the basic, like, I know like for a lot of people that read Schmitt, this is pretty basic, but
so
how do you arrive at the paradox? Like, how do you have a sovereign population, but then who decides when it comes to those like states of exception or those issues, like even just like a culture war issue. Like,
Well,
and I want to cover your recent piece too, because you talk about
so
Wilhelm Reich, but
so the idea is, in a sense, and sovereignty is a good question there too, right? So we come up with this idea of the rule of law, which in shorthand, I think on a practical level, what most people mean by that is that the law is meant to apply to everyone the same. Right. You know what I mean? But that's not technically what, if you look at the history of the concept of the rule of law, that's not technically what it's supposed to. And the reason why he calls that book Political Theology is he roots it back. He says, democracy was a response to the old hierarchical system of, king and nobles and so forth, right? Yeah. So he says, you have to understand, if you go back to this, that the idea of the sovereign king comes from a sovereign God. And so the king is the representative of God. His authority actually doesn't come from the people, right? He is not answerable to the people. He's answerable to God for his actions, right? And so in the same way, he goes through this whole thing of talking about the miraculous, right? And he says the king is very much, in a sense, like the miraculous, in a sense that the king makes a pronouncement of law, and it's like a miracle, like Jesus walking on the water. So the king then pronounces, in some ways, the will of God for the people, right? And it's in some ways it's symbolic, but these symbols then become very, very real and live, right? So, but the king, by his role, pronounces what. So the king, in some sense, stands outside and above the law as the symbol of the divine lawmaker, right?
Yeah, and so he was getting this like from the sort of the old, like at the time that he was writing, the sort of German fascination with anthropology,
right?
Yeah, like the German fascination with anthropology, like with Sir James Frazer, for instance, like the God King, and like as an emissary of divine forces on earth, and so like that's very ancient in human history. Yeah,
that's right. So as the democratic idea sweeps that away, so with the rise of the merchant classes, right, the bourgeoisie, they want to jockey for power. Well, they're not willing to accept that, because that power, the power of the church and the power of the king, again, because those were real states, they limited the power of economics, of things. So in a sense, it was unseemly, because that aided the land-based morality. But mercantilism was unseemly. People who chased after money were money grubbers. You know what I mean?
Right.
So in a sense, part of the rise of the bourgeoisie is to kind of sweep away this order. But then if you sweep away this order, you answer the question, well, where does law come from? Well, law comes from it comes from, in a sense, the people. It emerges out of the will of the people. So the will of the people then becomes the substitute for the will of God. But once law is enacted, it becomes, in a sense, its own enclosed system. And this was the idea of a rational law. So we weren't going to anymore base morality on divine pronouncements. And this was like the whole Kantian thing, right? So you could basically, because they would just see morality out there, like it's obvious to everybody. Well, of course, in a Christian context, morality is obvious because
it's not a priori, it's categorical imperative.
Yeah, they're just seeing it culturally, but for them it was an a priori. This is just obvious, it's logical. So law then becomes the same way, a kind of rational, logical. It's obvious. The laws are self-evident, right, out there. And so we have this closed system of law, and now, in a sense, rather than the king ruling us, we are ruled by the law, right? So you have the self-contained legal system. And in some way, this legal system of laws is supposed to be able to account for everything.
Yeah.
And Schmitt says there is no system so good that your system of laws can account for everything. The law itself cannot rule. He says you have to take into account there is a person who writes the law, there is somebody who interprets the law, and there is somebody who enforces the law. So he says this idea of the rule of law is a polite fiction that masks from us the real power structures of what's going on, right? The law just doesn't arrive miraculously as a self-evident enclosed system. And then he sort of presses it to its limit, right? And he says, well, what happens if there's a real crisis that the law cannot account for? And that can't be accounted for even within the law. So even if you make a provision for, say, a dictator to take the reins of the system in a crisis, he says, what if there's a crisis so big that even the dictator can't deal with it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That the whole system falls apart, right? And so who then, he asked then, who then is able to set aside the whole system, remake it, and put it back in place? And he says that person is sovereign.
Yes.
Right?
He decides a state of exception, because people, people could say that the rule of law is blind, but we know that's not true.
Well, and he says it's a polite fiction. Yeah. He says, so you want to be looking at, and this is where his comments on the administrative state get, Schmidt's comments on the administrative state get really interesting.
I was going to mention the managerial state, how he basically says that pure rationalistic, objective managerialism is almost impossible, but that's...
It is. So what happens then is that the managers end up writing the law.
Yeah.
And you could see this very much happen within, even though they were doing it within the system, right? The managers become a power unto themselves.
Well, the managers were like the sort of the professional managerial class, the expertism class. They were ascended. They were drunk on their own, like Fingal Ding and all those ghouls. They were like drunk on their own power and relevance, which are like, by the way, it's very pathetic seeing them try to like claw their relevance back, but it's not going to happen. You know, like all those fake doctors on Twitter trying to like post their way into relevance is like obscene, you know. But those people, like there was this article the other day about, I have to use you still can't say the term on YouTube, but you know, you remember I was always using the term sacrament. There was this article the other day that's asked, why didn't the unsacramented warn us now that there's such negative outcomes of the sacrament? I go, you did, but you basically criminalized us. You turned like me and you into like second-class citizens in their own country. So like this whole thing about, actually, not only were you right, okay, yeah, maybe you're right about everything, even though we said you were wrong about everything. But now that we know that you're right about everything, why didn't you warn us about it? I go, well, we tried, but you told us that we were wrong. So, and you said that it was illegal to be wrong.
We kept our heads down and shut up because we didn't want to lose our jobs or get drummed out of society.
Yeah, and then basically they decided, they decided the state of exception that if you were unsacramented, you were an aberration into the rule of law, and that you must be dealt with extrajudicial means that were against the norm. Yeah,
it's interesting that you use that word sacrament, unsacrament, because I put it very clearly into religious terms. Clean and unclean. And you could very much see.
Yeah, I think we talked about this on the TL.
Yeah, we may have
talked in 2021.
We might have messaged back and forth, but there is that sense of you know, if you if you won't wear a mask or whatever, you won't, you know, and there was that sense that those that wouldn't follow the prescriptions were unclean.
Yeah,
and you could almost see them like in the old biblical.
But that you were a rule breaker, that you violated.
Unclean.
Yeah. The plague days, or that you were like in Canada, you were sort of like, you know, the average leaf is very like, you know, not very like, don't rock the boat, eh? Like, don't bother anyone. It's like, that's, you know,
my wife is a bit that way. Like, she doesn't want to rock the boat, but
it's funny though, because like during the time, I think I said this to Liamachu, where like if you worked in like, you know, semi-rural or like working class places, like if you went to like a Rona or like a mechanic shop or whatever, like then nobody like would ask you.
No.
But if you like went into like, I don't know, a Sobeys, you guarantee like someone would harass you, or they would, you know. And
or something. Yeah. So if you went into like a no frills, you could probably get away with it.
Yeah, but if you went to like Zares, probably not.
High-end Loblaws at the other end of town, yeah, forget it.
Yeah. No. Oh yeah, you have Loblaws up there. Yeah. So that's what I mean. Like if you went into
Fortino's, if you went into Fortino's, somebody's going to ask you to put your mask on.
Oh God, if you went
to... I know.
Holy crap.
I know. Yeah.
This is like no one knows what we're talking about, but like, except for like people that are like in Ontario. But like, so the state of exception, like you were talking about, but when it comes to like deciding the exception, eventually, like Schmidt says that the whole of society becomes like the exception eventually becomes the rule, because you can't like turn that process off. And I think like under the recent happenings of the past few years, we see that the system, not only does it have sources of fragility, but when it comes, the terrifying nature of the system, especially here in Canada, is that not only is it half fragile, but the parts that are anti-fragile probably don't, like, that's the scary part, that it actually is anti-fragile in terms of the power structure. But when it comes to the management, the actual on the ground, like the healthcare system, for instance, that's the stuff that is incredibly fragile. But the stuff that is not fragile is what's terrifying, which is the permanent exception. So maybe you could get into like a bit of that. Like, I mean, not just in Canada, but also like elsewhere, like even in America, like you have this, you know, the political system itself has this like as much as I don't want to blackpill and say that like the whole turbo American thesis is correct, it does seem that the system, the way it's structured at least, maybe not like in recent years, but there does tend to be an anti-fragility to the actual, you know, managers and policy wonks and like people that constitute the functioning of the system rather than the elected part of it that people only focus on. Well, you know what I mean? Yeah.
There's like a kind of two minds, and this is maybe a good segue into talking a little bit about Alul.
Yeah.
Is that part of the problem that we have in talking politics is people do not understand the nature of technique and the technical system, right? So Alul is really good in a sense that what he does, he says, you know, you have to understand that devices and machines, like actual technology, is not the heart of the technical system. Now, most people, most common, even people on the far right or whatever, who are fairly awake in a sense politically, still many of them do not understand this. So when they think of technology, they're thinking of machines and devices and so forth. But technology and technique, argues Alul, is more a way of thinking, right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, it is the operating system upon which everything in the managerial class runs. So it's the way in which everything is like nothing is organic, right? Nothing emerges organically. Everything is rationalized. It's examined. It's broken down to its constituent parts, right? And then you come up with a system that tells you so everything, like so teaching, for example, right? So you have a whole thing of teaching methods, blah, 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 blah. So you can basically slot any person of reasonable intelligence in there, give them the techniques, and they will produce relatively consistent educational outcomes, right? It's like teaching people the Walmart way, the Amazon way, you know, customer service.
It's very much for like anyone to plug and play and
quality control all the way across. So you
McDonald's workers have a set instruction for
that's exactly it. So that's all this kind of technical thinking, right? But so then you get it into like its organizational structure. So it's where every question, again, the rule of law, every question can be answered by the policy manual, right? So if you've ever been in a committee meeting, right, where people are talking about, well, what's important here is that we have good process, right? I'm thinking like, no, what's important is that we get the right result. If the process is a total disaster, but we still end with the right result, to me, that's a win. But to a technically minded person, the result is almost irrelevant. And that's why I said to people too, like with COVID, it doesn't matter whether they were successful or not. And the real point of COVID was to refine their emergency response policies. The technique and the technical system that underlies it. It was to build it, reinforce it, explore it, take it apart. So that way they could produce consistent results at the other end. So if they get bad results, it's not an excuse to fire everybody. No. All these smart people then say, oh, good, we have data now. Now we can go back and refine the process, right? So that's kind of technical thinking.
Yeah, one logic of exception feeds into the next logic of exception.
That's right. And so people ask, well, why is business gone woke? Well, business has gone woke because it runs on the same operating system as the administrative state, which is technique. Yes. So management in a big business is exactly the same as management in government, right? And it's all about this policy-oriented, rules-oriented, rule of law, systems, committee, you know, so everything is in this. And, you know, it's the idea is that if we put in place the right system, put in place the right resources, we can solve any problem that humanity faces. And that's kind of the ideological system.
The utopian end of history, liberal ideal. Right. Yeah.
And so when you've done with it, so the idea is that you've got this kind of ideological way of thinking, right? And so and then you get into kind of the fragility of the system, right? So Alul argues is that we've always had the technical with us, right? But when it's embedded in a real cultural system that places limits on it and understands that it's organic and it serves the needs of a particular community and it's embedded or whatever, right? There, it can be very robust. But as you push it, he argues that there's 4 basic rules of technology, right? Laws of technology. He says that technology is not good or bad, right? Technology doesn't care. It's ambivalent, okay? So technology, when you introduce it, will have effects, okay? Any technology you introduce will have effects. So he says that every technical stage, there is a price to be paid. So whatever goods you have, there is a cost. There are evils that come with every...
Well, very similar to Uncle Ted, like it atrophies other sources of knowledge that,
So he says that at every new stage of technical sophistication, so if you say have a problem with a technology and you try to solve it with another technology, right? So for example, your kids are watching porn on the laptops. So you put in with a content blocker, right? The content blocker, it raises more problems and greater problems than it solves, right? Okay, and that's what he argues. And then he says the harmful effects are inseparable from the positive effects. So you can't have a purely good technology, right? And then every technology as you introduce it will have a great number of unforeseen effects. So there's always things that you can't predict. And so Ellul argues that the more technical that you become, it becomes all these problems begin to accumulate exponentially. So you get more and more, it's very powerful. So you can, the system gets more and more powerful as it grows, but it also creates more and more problems and more, and it does it, exponentially, right? So the example that you can use is like your old jalopy. So you've got your old pickup that you can tinker around with. This thing has run since the 50s and it'll keep running forever, right? Versus a Formula One car, which you're lucky if it, with all the horsepower and sophistication and design in that thing, if it makes it through a whole race, you're doing great, right? So take, for example, like say we used to have a supply and distribution networks, logistics, that was very, very, and again, resilient, right? So you had warehouses full of stuff. It was slow and clunky. So if there were supply problems in Taiwan, it didn't matter because you had a year of supply in your warehouse, right? So somebody clever comes up and says, well, let's take all that waste out of the system, just-in-time supply. So now you've turned your whole supply system from an old jalopy into a Formula One race car. Well, what happens when you enter into a problem in the system? The whole thing breaks down, and now your Formula One race car is sitting on the side of the road. And this is what happened during COVID. So you enter a stress on the system, and you're going to see within our system, so you have these remarkably powerful systems in government and business, and they are tremendously powerful. But they're becoming increasingly more and more fragile to stresses, right? And so you're going to see them kind of compensating. They might go back a little bit to more like warehouse type of, but the whole technical system is, and Ellul argues this, he says the only thing that really stops it is to say, wait a minute, we didn't know what we were in the bargain for. Let's stop using this technology. And he says that's the one thing that we don't do. And that's the unreason in the system. So we go back to that whole beginning of the transition from the monarchical period and the humility to the rule of the bourgeoisie merchant class, right? Well, what did they want to get rid of? They wanted to get the limits off of commerce and trade, the limits off of learning, the limits off.
Well, that was the big. This is like literally, like this is the essence of woke capital, like you were saying. And Marx is kind of right about that, about everything's all melting into air, that big business eventually, that sort of the capitalist system eventually will have to liquidate certain forms of social relations that are inhibiting, like multiculturalism is like probably the best example in our case.
Everything is subordinate to the market, right? Yeah. And we see that, right? So everything
the movement of populations is inherently advantageous to a global market. So
that's right.
Yeah.
So
cultural taboos and xenophobia isn't. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so really the counter to this, and then you begin to say it, right? So you say it out loud. Well, no, you can't unwind the clock, but in a sense, you can learn from. This is what Del Noce says. He says that the argument from the left is that history is axiological. In other words, since there is no going back, that you can only go forward.
If liberalism failed, we need more liberalism. Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, but Del Noce says no. He says there is this thing called tradition that you can learn from the past, right? And so you can make and that's the other reason why the left fears the church, is because the church has a living tradition. Mm-hmm. So part of that living tradition of Christian teaching is that, well, you can't worship both God and money. So in a sense, the market needs to be subordinate to faith values. And so like Schmitt would go from the perspective of the state, and he would say that no, the market needs to be subordinate to the unitary needs of the people. The people need to, right? So in the friend-enemy distinction, so the friends need to take care of themselves, right? And the market is potentially a threat to the well-being of the friends, right? Because the market has its own exigencies, its own demands. And so you as a state doing your right thing, you need to restrain the market for the well-being of your friends. And see, we're not ready. And the same thing too. So for you run from a Christian perspective, because of your devotion to God, you restrain your economic ambitions, because you have been told, the tradition tells you, that to pursue these economic pursuits uninhibited will corrupt your relationship with God and, threaten your eternal, where you're going for eternity. So you have to put your economic aspirations under and beneath and subordinate to your moral and faith relationship with God. And so in some sense that Schmitt, he was a Catholic, right? They're coming at the same thing. So whereas we have with technology and the market, and they go hand in hand, we have basically said, no, we're just going to let the market go unrestrained, and we're going to let technology go unrestrained, and everything must be subordinate to both tech and the market. Well, you're getting to the point now where, the market unrestrained is beginning to show some very ugly sides. That, as you begin to accumulate wealth in fewer and fewer hands on a global scale, they're going to try to cut everybody else out of the pie for their own good. And who restrains them? Nobody. And eventually it's going to probably come to the time like the only restraint is and against the will to power, which is the guillotine. Right. And it's an ugly sort of end, or all of these people who are very wealthy repent and return to the Lord or whatever. Or from a political perspective, you have a functioning state that says that no, protecting our citizens from the predations of the economic giants is more important than the prosperity that these economic giants bring. Mm-hmm. And so these are the kind of things. But when you're talking conservatism, now you get into that whole question that Oren McIntyre was dealing in his piece this morning, is that, okay, now what are you going to teach your kids, right? What does it mean to be an American? Like, can you see any red-blooded American saying that, no, we need to restrain the market through law and through religion? And basically, you're going to get called a communist, right? And so,
which is ironically like I was thinking previously we were talking about Canada, how if you want to talk about Americanization, during the 80s Mulrooney reign, where free trade versus like NAFTA was they were pro NAFTA because free trade is good, the liberals are going to crush free trade, blah blah blah. But that was one of the first instances of the full Americanization of Canada.
That's right. And we didn't see it because we were sold a bill of goods that said, no. Once we get free things, it's going to bring all these jobs. It's going to be great. Well, yeah, you know what? We should have paid attention, okay, who's pitching this idea, and really paid close attention to the notion, okay, we're going to be the smart people who have ideas, and everybody else in the third world is going to make our stuff, or in Mexico is going to make stuff for us. And if somebody thought about it and realized, wait a minute, only about 10% of the population make up the smart crowd. So who's going to take care of the other 90% of the people? And
the useless chuds,
and the thing is you hate to admit it. I voted Mulrooney, and I was that type of conservative at the time, and all of a sudden I woke up and you realize, you know what? All those crazy union boss guys from Ed Broadbent and the boys, they were all right about NAFTA.
Yeah,
about getting rid of it, right? They were all right. They knew what was coming, Yeah, and we but this was the whole idea. But the idea of subordinating the economic and the technological to a moral constraint, either religious or political, was just beyond the pale.
Unheard of, yeah.
Unheard of. And now you're in a sense of when you go back and look at pre-industrialization conservatives, and you're going that's the kind of things that they were warning people about. You know what I mean? Like the enclosure laws and all the rest of the stuff in England, right? That's what they were warning about. So there was a time and a period where people looked at the coming of industry and saw unrestrained industry as an evil for society. The Charles Dickens days.
Yeah.
Right? And we just poo-pooed it all and said no, the prosperity it brings, we can just deal with that. You know what I mean? And they were all right. But now, in the sense of conservatism is a meaningless idea, but because there really isn't much left to conserve.
No.
And again, it comes back to you circle around. Where is it that there is a living tradition that is in a sense still intact enough that's worth preserving, right? As we've talked about, all the sort of the political stuff on the right is just a mess. The only place where there's a real living tradition that way that can offer a coherent system of restraint to both economics and technology is in the Christian tradition. And that's in a sense why the left fears it. And that's why I believe in others like Stalin Frog on Twitter. And he's of the mind too, and others like him, that whatever comes and whatever happens going forward, it's going to be Christian. And it isn't going to be big tent conservatism. And it may be that there's a period of wilderness outside of electoral politics, that America becomes California. But whatever resistance comes to the system is going to come because Christians wake up and realize that we need to apply our faith to subordinate economics and technology to our belief system. And I don't think I don't have all the answers of how to do that, because these things have been let out of the box. It's like the old story of Cain and Abel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where God tells Cain, the evil is there circling around you and wants to have you, but you have to master it. These old stories get told for a reason, right? So that's it. Evil is now circling around economics and the dangers of technology. And it's incumbent upon us as human beings to master it. Well, what's really the only coherent system today that says, well, in many ways, the most extant one is the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
And so I believe whatever comes out, that's why, I think it's really incumbent upon Christians to sort of start waking up and realizing we have a task to do in terms of figuring out as a community what the appropriate relationship to both economics and technology is. Like, how do we live with it in a sense that we are masters, and God, shall we say, through us is the master of money and the master of technology, rather than us being mastered by the economy and mastered by technology.
Well, this is like the essence of archaeofuturism, which I think even the original doctrine of fascism, not the German permutation, but the original spirit of trying to wed the thread of tradition and modernity has always been at the heart of the right wing in the 20th century. But I wanted to ask about Schmitt, but before we get to that, because what I want to ask about Schmitt, I think maybe we have to prayer wall through. But
for time. I know but
no, what I was going to ask is you brought up about that point from Stalin Frog, and we didn't really get to Twitter, but it seems in the E-right there's this divide between okay, I understand there are a lot of critiques of the trads that are good, because a lot of them are just LARPers, and then you get these trad women who are basically trying to create a lifestyle grift, and all the wholesome Chungus, heckin' wholesome working class, multicultural working class, and I have to go to my homestead even though I work a tech job. That's how I can afford a homestead. Blah blah blah. But
I know
there is this critique that the Bapians make that not to stereotype, but they have more of the Nietzschean techno-futurist view, where basically what did Bap say? He said, moral revival has never worked, and even AA has echoed this, right? Even though I love academic age and I'm as fat as soldier, but the moral revival has never worked, and that basically the fantasy of
North America returning to its Christian roots is gone, and that you have to embrace more of like a Nietzschean understanding of like more of like a secular right wing that is explicitly, well, let's say, a fan of certain regimes of the 20th century. So,
yeah. So
what would you say to that? Yeah, that criticism.
Okay. So
the divide in the
you
right.
Trouble here before because I am, and Stalin is the same way too. Is I am not a Baptist, right?
Yeah.
And in part because I think he's wrong about religious revivalism, and there's a long tradition of religious revival, and especially Christian religious revival. But the big thing, and this is one of the things why people should be reading Augusto Del Noce, is and Del Noce's not afraid to talk about, like, he talks about Giovanni Gentile as like a serious philosopher, and you're like, dude, this is like, like set your hair on fire, right? But he interacts with these guys, and so, but what Del Noce notes is that
we had fascism in Italy at the end of the war had to capitulate to the Catholic Church.
But Del Noce notes that fascism is as post-Nietzschean as Marxism is. So he says, he argues that Marx is a future utopianism, right?
Yes.
Whereas he says that the fascist looks back into history, but not he's not a Christian in the sense that it's a real living belief. So it looks back at this stuff as if it is myth. So it's a post-Nietzschean world. So it's not really real, but these are just myths and stories. But they look back that there was a period in the past where we got as close as we could to utopia, right? And so what he says, so what we need to do is we need to return to this past utopia. So what Del Noce argues is that both fascism and Marxism are mirrors of the society. So Marx is future utopianism, and fascism is past utopianism. So basically, fascism argues if we sweep away the present order and return, there's that favorite word on the right, and we return to the past where
burn it down and start again.
Like they're starting down again with utopia as they saw it in the past, or as they imagine it was in the. So utopia is not rooted in the future, the unknown future past the revolution that we can't tell. No. We know what utopia is. We saw it in the past, and so if we sweep away the present order, we can reinstantiate utopia today. So they're basically two utopian philosophies. They're both post-Nietzschean. They're both atheist, and they're basically trying to do the same thing. One is future utopianism, and the other is past utopianism. And then as a contrast, Del Noce offers then the contrast is a real living tradition in an immutable transcendent order, which neither of those two systems can abide. And he says that really is found in, and for him, he's a Catholic, in the Christians, and for him specifically, the Catholic tradition. Right.
But I do feel like to defend.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. You finish your. Yeah.
So in that sense, this is Del Noce says is that there is a door number 3. We don't have to either go the path of, well, reactionary utopianism or revolutionary utopianism. We can just deal with, and he says the big divider between the two is the concept of original sin. We can deal with a flawed world, knowing that whatever things we do are provisional. We're never going to arrive at utopia, but we're just going to do the best we can. And we're going, and what Del Noce argues is, when you have an idea of original sin, when you build institutions and they endure, you realize that the institution we have, while imperfect, is the best that we've managed to do. So it's worth maintaining and supporting and reinvigorating as time goes along.
Yeah, but I feel like, as much as I'm sympathetic, like to like sort of strawman the Nietzschean vitalist or fascist, view, is that there definitely is a spirit within like Faustian civilization, what you call like European Faustianism, that does tend towards like the travailing of newer space, and will always be inherently both reactionary but also forward-looking in a sense. And I feel like the problem is that when it comes to the third option of a living Christian tradition, is that like the people that are at the helm of that are basically like Fed Caths and like these doughy like Rod Dreher integralists or like Vermeulen or like those people that have basically like co-opted a more like normie conservative position, but from this like fantasy of integralism or from like Guadalupe nationalism or whatever. Like it's so BAP is correct about the FedCast, I think.
Well, he is, and in some ways, I think that you wonder. So in a sense,
like fascism is not like one thing.
Question with a lot of them, and within too, and it's very hard. You have to be very, very careful when you're challenging somebody's sincerity of faith, right?
Right.
When I look at the sort of the trad Catholic movement or whatever, it has that whiff.
Not all trad Catholics. I mean, like specifically these people. These,
but it has that whiff of past utopianism.
Yeah.
So it has that. It has, in a sense, that they're reaching into the same well, in my mind, that the fascists reach into, even though they're not fascist. If that makes sense.
No, they hate. Like they would balk at. Yeah,
yeah.
They, like, try to avoid it.
They really want nothing to do, in many ways, with the kind of people the kind of Christians that have messed up theology, but where the supernatural is a very living reality for them.
Well, look at Rod Dreher, like the strongest soldiers of Christian faith in America, he would throw them under the bus and dox them. So, you know what I mean? Like, because you'd say, oh, you're Christian fascists.
Well, that's exactly it, right? And so for Dreher, he has no use for Calvinists, No. And so there is a kind of thing where, we want a vibrant Christianity, but for him, I look at now he's talking about his next book is going to be on what does he call it? Re-enchanting the world. So in a sense, I think and this is one of the weird things about Dreher, is he's often ahead of the game in terms of identifying the problem, but he's not. He can't get outside of himself to really take the next step, or he's not smart enough or whatever. There's something about him where he just can't take that next step. You know what I mean? Where, the Benedict option is in many ways the right way to go. But then people will say, but if you're successful at this, the regime is just going to notice you and step on you, right? And that's where you read somebody like Ellul and says, like, okay, you may have to do a hard thing and you might have to arm up to protect yourself, right?
Well, like Ellul is saying,
it's ugly and it's evil, but Ellul was a French Catholic, right? So it's he has a bit of that sort of hard nose. So he says he'll talk about how the world of grace, Christianity is about love. It's not violent or whatever. But he says we live in a sinful world, and sometimes the option isn't between good and evil. It's between a greater evil and a lesser evil. And sometimes the right decision is to do something that endangers and imperils your soul, which is to take up guns and arms in a revolutionary posture. But he says you have to know and recognize you're doing something evil, but it's your best option. And Dreher doesn't get to that point where doing something evil as the best option is a door for him, right? And so at the same time, he wants to bring in the supernatural, but he wants to bring in the supernatural in a way that readers of the New York Times would be comfortable with it. So that's
what I mean. Like he's willing to like he has the same problem that the wholesome Chungus surrealists do. Like he's willing to just belly roll and be like, as long as you leave me alone, I'm fine with that. Like he doesn't realize that like the forces of evil that we're facing, like they're not going to leave you alone. Like that's but also like Ellul said, like technique or like I guess Spengler called it technics. Like this existed before just like the iPhone, like before the printing press, before the process of technology realized technique into existence. But the thing is, like, one thing I will say though, in defense of people that critique like the trad Catholics or like the trad orthos or whatever, is that they say that like the forward, like to look at religion as a which I mean, as a Catholic, I more agree with them. I'm not like a Baptist. I'm like, I myself am not a Baptist in the sense, well, I mean, come on, look at me. Like, I mean, I'm trying to lift weights and everything, but like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not like, as much as I have like friends that are Baptists and all that, like, I don't like subscribe 100%. No. But I would say that a critique that both, ironically enough, Baptists and now the people that BAP is going to war with. They both say that like this like view of Christianity would neglect a lot of things that I have to be very careful to say on YouTube, like race and certain questions of ethnic loyalties that certain people have, like that they would ignore it. And so what I wanted to ask you, which I might have to paywall, would be Carl Schmitt. Why was he so sympathetic to the Austrian painter then? Like, what was that his recourse, is to join the Austrian, the painter of Austrians party? Why did he find that as a solution to his paradox of the state of exception? Is it because like that they were appealing to a metaphysical view of race and the Volk, or was it because of other reasons? Like, why did he view?
He was a very ambitious man.
Yeah.
So he
was a legal scholar. So
yeah. So
he was a lawyer.
That's right. He attached himself to the party as a way to get.
Oh, you can't say it on YouTube, just in case. The Austrian painter.
The Austrian painter. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No. I go through every podcast. I censor stuff, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, don't worry about it.
It's all right. Let's get the Austrian. You know what? I was a little slow on the uptake. It's fine.
The painter of Austrians. Yeah.
You know what? I've added it up now. Okay, it's But
we're talking about Ivan Shilo, and we're talking about Austrian painters.
Yeah. So it's like same thing. Like Mircea Eliade was the same way too, right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
He had the same basic views too.
But, the Romanian painter.
Yeah. So for Schmidt, I think that it was more ambition, and he said some very unfortunate things that he probably believed, But and this is, I think, Schmidt talks about this somewhat and again using Sorel, who is a Marxist.
Yeah.
But in the crisis of parliamentary democracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
He uses he works through the whole question of Marxism or whatever, and comes up with the argument. He says that if you have to put push comes to shove, that which is the more powerful motivator, class, right?
Right.
And what he calls it, myth. Which is, of course,
myth, 100%. Yeah.
Right. So we know what the myth is. So myth is this sort of like culture.
I'm sorry, Twinksorg. I'm sorry, Tinksorg. I keep calling him Twinksorg.
Yeah, Tinksorg. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Tinksorg, but
Yeah. So Schmidt argued that if the push comes to shove between the two, that the people, the proletariat, aren't going to choose class. They're going to choose myth and race over. And Del Noce notes the same thing. One of the big snags that they reached in the 30s with Marxism, and this is why it transmuted. This is why they were so open to the transmutation.
Well, it became third worldist. It became ethnically based Marxism in the global East. Yeah.
But the Marxism was predominantly the philosophy among the bourgeoisie.
Right.
It was not a proletariat philosophy. The philosophy that the proletariat wanted and liked, they really liked fascism. Yeah. They liked something based on culture, myth.
True chud philosophy.
That's right. And so for them, so in practice, this is why he argues this is why you get the transmutation of revolutionary thinking into the sexual revolution. Yeah. So then the bourgeoisie absorb the sexual revolution. The capitalists make peace with Marxism through the sexual revolution, and they use the sexual revolution to attack the real enemy of the bourgeoisie, which is again, the Bible believing chud. Yeah. Right. And so because they threw that whole process.
The chud Morlock working class Bible believing. Yeah.
That's
going
right.
to church on Sunday.
So, your humble Catholic worker, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And all of these kind of things. So they were destroyed through sex. So it really is. And that's what my latest piece was about, is it really is all about sex. Right?
Exactly.
And they're using sex to destroy the working class.
Well,
but it's not the working class, though, because it's not about class. It's about what the people in like the proletariat believe. These are the guys that go to church and they actually believe in, like, for real, and not just sort of ironically or because it's good to be seen going to church or whatever. These are the people that actually believe. And so they have to be destroyed because, they liked fascism because that was myth and so forth. But it's all kind of tangled up together. And that's why anyone on the right who objects, it's easy to label if you want to be in favor of tradition you're right away a fascist, because you can lump you all into that same, what I mean? Because Del Noce really helps you understand why the left goes for that accusation all the time, because they really believe it, that if you're a Christian, you're a fascist, because you believe in historical truth,
restricting my tingles. Yeah,
you're just basically a fascist, and you just don't know it yet, but your Christian beliefs basically expose you as a fascist. And
like this is like the essence of psychosexuality. Like
that's exactly
basically, like, well, to Wilhelm Reich, the reason that sexual liberation equals freedom is because it really is the opening up of the self. I mean, he wasn't completely wrong about certain things from like a more mystical perspective, like the orgone thing, but like he just was wrong in that his like Freudo-Marxist nonsense about like sexual liberation delivering you into a higher plane of existence, which is very like kind of like quasi-Gnostic idea. But like, I mean, even that term is being abused by like the James Lindsay like dork web people now.
James Lindsay is just like there's a guy who was like, if there was ever a guy who exposed the reality of just remember that a disgruntled leftist is not a conservative, James Lindsay is your poster boy for that.
Yeah, it's just like it's incredible. Like now he's attacking phenomenology, even though like phenomenology had this huge Catholic turn in the 20th century after Merleau-Ponty. Like it's just like even Heidegger. Like there are people like I remember in grad school, like literally every year, be like someone would come up to my prof and be like, I can't read Heidegger because Heidegger was a fan of the Austrian painter, and I can't do that. And it's like, like bro, like come on, like there was a clear reason why Heidegger, like, you know what I mean? Like I will
like read Heidegger. Like it's not that hard to figure out why he had sympathies. Yeah.
No, but even like I guess you didn't answer the question. Like, are you were going to, but then we cut you off with like because I want to talk more about sexual liberation in your recent piece. But like, why was Schmitt? Was it just his careerism that led him to the painter of Austrians?
I believe so. So, and again, like cultural,
or was it his system, the way that he set up that analysis of his?
I think it was probably a dual thing in a sense. Like his decision is the idea of decisionism.
Yeah.
So, the belief that one man could represent the will of the people.
It was a total society in every single
That's
way.
right. And in a sense, it was a unified society, a unitary
society. It was aesthetic politics,
Yeah, it's aesthetic politics. And if you ever can get a hold of a piece, I think you'll like this movie. It's a documentary called The Architecture of Doom.
Oh, I think
the aesthetics of the regime. The German painters regime. But it's tremendous. It's not necessarily sympathetic, but it talks about how they really understood this as an aesthetic movement.
Yeah, and Benjamin was right that it was like the aestheticization of politics.
Yeah, The Architecture of Doom. I think you can get it on YouTube now. I have it. I recorded it off of broadcast TV back in the day when you could still run shows like this on TV. But it's that one is phenomenal. But I think it's partly his ambition. Partly it is just picking up the cultural prejudices of the day. So, for example, like we talk about like radical Islam, right?
Yeah.
So, you'll have guys that will go up and blow up things, right?
Yeah.
But they are supported by a broad range of people who are never going to blow something up, but who share all the same basic prejudices that.
100%.
Right? So I could see Schmidt as somebody who, while not being a hardcore party guy, you know what I mean, had enough of the basic cultural sympathies that it wasn't really a big leap for him to write some very skeezy things to sort of prove.
I think because even as a Catholic, I think because he like I forget who it was. I think the bureaucrat wrote about this in American Sun about Schmidt and about like why a legal scholar was like seduced by this, but also I think like his Catholicism, like he saw the failure of like the German aristocracy at the time during Weimar. And I know like certain writings, like I think Martin translated a few about like his certain writings during the Painter of Austrians regime. But what was he writing in the 30s and 40s? Was it when he died?
Mostly what he was doing was poking holes in the Weimar system.
That's right.
He looked at it and basically said like he's looking.
Outsiders are determining the exception for that.
And he's going, this stuff is all stupid and it's riddled with all kinds of philosophical inconsistencies. It's just a bunch of, and so he began poking holes in it, right? And so even though he was one of the guys that helped write the Weimar Constitution, he, in the same sense, saw its basic flaws and picked them apart. And, some people have argued that it was his writing that gave the little push and shove to the whole Weimar regime and just kind of shoved it over, because he largely just took the foundation out from underneath it.
Well, it literally was like, he would say, outsiders writing the exception for them, which can never happen in a real state. Like that was the problem with Weimar, is that you had French and British people and Americans coming, well, more French and British, technocrats writing the German way of life into existence. And then we all know what happened with that.
Well, and there was and really, because the two world wars are not two separate wars, but one war, right?
Yeah.
That in many ways, all of the grievances that were nursed in how that the First World War ended justified everything that happened in the Second World War. Right? Yeah. So it was, Germany was so put upon in terms of the cost that was extracted from it in terms of punishments, that it made it very, very easy for the opponents to, call the people who were in support of the liberal regime, like the liberal way of thinking, as basically tools of our enemies.
And so,
and that's like they have firmly become a client state of America. So it's going to be like Western playground, and
it's Afghanistan all over again.
Don't consider it there. Yeah, exactly.
You know what's funny about Afghanistan is that there was this, and I want to move on to the sexual revolution and Twitter.
Sure.
But there was this tweet that got like, it's one of those anime accounts, but it's not like our guys, right? It's more of like the left-weight anime accounts, the Twitch anime. There you go. Where he's like, he gives these photos of like these places in Kandahar during the surge, and like in Kandahar, and like in what was the other, the capital of Afghanistan? What's it called? Kabul. Yeah. Where they have like McDonald's and Burger King. He's like, this is why they'll never defeat American industrial power. I'm like, bro, you realize that those like fast food slop. Oh, sorry, kids. You realize that the soy slop, but replace the S with a G. You realize that those places, that essentially America controlled those city states in Afghanistan, and all those rural provinces like Waziristan and elsewhere, that they had no control over. Near the Obama years, they were just policing those major cities. And so that's why they could have McDonald's. And I believe in Canada, we had Tim Hortons in Afghanistan, because we didn't go to Iraq. We had Tim Hortons in Afghanistan, but it was in Kandahar. So go ahead.
Oh, no, it's all like, and it's crazy. Then you see the pictures of like these Afghani women in gender equality seminars and stuff.
You
see the disgusting looks on their faces, right? And they're like, they're getting some benefit out of it, so they just sit down and shut up and you think to yourself, like, they said there was so much NGO money slushing around in there that they really thought that they could turn Afghanistan into a modern Western nation just simply by throwing money at it.
You know what's funny about the women's lib point is that I pointed this out on Twitter. I said that, this is an old tactic, because during the Yugoslavian war, you had like Susan Sontag putting on a production of Godot in the middle of Bosnia when it was getting shelled by the Serbians. Like, it's like, this is like, that's the regime's face, is like gay marriage and like, gender seminars for women in Afghanistan. Like, that's
it comes down to, again, it underscores the point that we kind of run down to, is that the sexual revolution is the left's primary tool. Especially post World War II. Once the market and technology have kind of sort of reached got their legs under them after the 1800s, that really after World War II and trying to figure out what you have to do in terms of anti-fascism, and then embracing the Freudian, Marxo-Freudianism.
Yeah.
That the sexual revolution then in the 20th century became the tool of the left for enacting liberalism. So liberalism became equated with libertinism, and even conservatives now, when you talk to them, use leftist framing for their understanding of liberty. Liberty
is for our freedoms.
It's freedom from, right? And or give me my rights, in a sense. You owe me something, right? You owe me. And so the whole idea of rights and freedoms have been so corrupted. Now, I think that the corruption of these ideas is embedded in them to begin with, and the only reason why they find proper grounding is due to a Christian culture. But this whole idea of the gap from liberalism to libertinism is not very far. And so even on the right, like there are very few, and this is the thing I think that the right has to really grapple with, is there aren't really many conservatives in America. They think they're conservatives, but they're not. They're really just basically right liberals. They're still liberals.
90s liberals.
Yeah, but they're still liberals, and they talk like liberals, but they don't. And again, that comes back to circle around. And this is why I think your only real meaningful opposition is going to come from a belief system that has once it can purify itself of Americanism, that Christianity has really the only cohesive idea system, theology, philosophy that can represent a real threat to the left. And I think a lot of people on the right don't realize this, that they truly don't really deep down actually oppose what the liberals are about. They just oppose this version of liberalism.
Yeah. I mean, that's like a cliched reactionary point, but it's true. I mean, the best example the other day, but I like deleted the tweet because I get annoyed at it, even though that Elon doesn't ban people right away. But it was about that one atrocious. She's like the absolute worst. The Kathy Riesowitz woman, Kathy Riesowitz from Reason Magazine.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so she had this tweet the other day, and here, in the 2010s, what happened after the Ron Paul revolution, when all the serious libertarians started becoming alt-right around, at the behest of Spencer, whatever. Even though Spencer, look at him nowadays, come on.
Yeah.
They you had libertarians that kept on. They basically just became libertines. Like Kathy Riesowitz became an editor or whatever at Reason, and she had these takes about how libertarianism made me an atheist, it made me polyamorous, I gave up my husband, and she has an OnlyFans even though she looks like a witch. And she had this tweet the other day that I capped, and I behind the block I said, look, this is my libertarianism, dog. And she said, in reply to some lib, she said, what did she say? She said that anything a child can do, an immigrant can do better. And so why should we worry about demographics when really we could just import the third world and they could be just as libertarian as we are? And I'm like, bro, this is my libertarianism. This is my OnlyFans e-girl, even though she's pushing 40. She's saying well, we don't need to have kids anymore. That's the thing. Yeah, it's incredible. And the thing is well, what do you think of Kathy Riesowitz? This is a Kathy Riesowitz 2-minute hate hour. So 2-minute hate.
Well, I'm not super. I mean, I know of her. I'm not super familiar with her work.
It's better. It's best that you're not. As a family man, it's best that you're not being familiar.
But she's not alone. There's the Aya thing or whatever.
Ayala works for Reason Magazine now. Right?
Yeah. So she's another one of these ones, and you get all
doesn't shower, talks about doing animals, and has a fascination with cheese pizza stuff. Yeah.
Andrew Tate is another one of these guys, right?
Yeah. He's the right wing. He's the
how is this guy a
right
wing? You bring to the sector. How is Andrew Tate a right wing hero? The dude runs. the dude is a pimp, and he runs a prostitution website that basically sells and you're how is this guy? That's you're these are the points where you want to go outside and find a brick wall and just bang your head until you're bleeding.
This is why I say that overt women hatred is probably not like, I understand like critiquing the woman question, but like overt like woman hatred to like Chud level, like Andrew Tate, like manosphere grifting. That's not good. That's not a right way.
No, and this is where too as well, and this is, I think, why it helps me also to have a background in theology, right? Is to understand the Christian teaching of, because Christianity isn't technically about equality,
right?
But what it really is about finding a new identity. So you have all of these things that you might have identified yourself to. So you might have been Greek, Hebrew, barbarian, Scythian. You might have been woman, man, Gentile, right? And so all of these categories, you put your faith in Christ. You are now in Christ.
Yeah.
And so all of these categories become subsumed in a new category. We are now, even though we have all these differences, we find a new identity. So my identity is no longer that I'm a woman, or that I'm a man, or that I'm Canadian or Dutch, or that I'm a Scythian, barbarian, free, whatever. But my identity is that I am in Christ. And so my story, I adopt this story of being in Christ and the Christian story of redemption and so forth. And then the process of enculturation into that community is discipleship. So then people actively take you by the hand and show you this is how we live. And Paul talks about various places, to be one in Christ. So they're trying to build a unitary community, a unified community. But within that community, it is still very hierarchical, right?
Yeah.
So there's certain roles where it says like a preacher is worth his wages or whatever, and some are to teach, some are to serve. And so there's all these differences of roles. And Paul uses the image of the body. He says, well, some are at the head, some are like your private parts. And okay, yeah, they're private parts, but we give them special treatment because we cover them up to show that we're modest and that they have a special significance, right?
Yeah.
So he's dealing with all of these things. And then he says, if one part of the body hurts, the whole body hurts, right? So you can't dismiss the feet because they're feet, or the eyes because they're eyes, just because they're not the brains. Because if you don't have one, you're not a whole body. But he says the body can't be whole. So you have this notion of a unified society, the erasing of old identities, the embracing of a new identity within a sense of a hierarchical system based on a new set of hierarchical values, which are spiritually related, in a sense, spiritual gifting and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Well, everything gets redone and reshuffled. All of the old things, okay, I was a philosopher and a big guy in the world. Well, that means nothing, because the first will be last, the last will be first, right? So you sell all you have. So all of these old ways of evaluating become subsumed in this notion of being in Christ. Well, that's a very cohesive system and a cohesive value system that when you talk about in terms of the rest of the world out there, well, how do you become a conservative? You know what I mean? Well, I don't really know, but I do know how people become Christians, right? And what that means.
Yeah.
And so forth, right? I forget where we were coming from this, but this idea of having a cohesive, unified value system, and this sort of hierarchy of values within that is something that's very, very missing from the world today. And well, I mean, Christians have it, but even I think Christians don't always understand what it is that they have as a set of ideas separate from, liberalism, globalism, the technocratic system or whatever.
Yeah, but then how would you negate, or how would you argue with the more right wing or ethno-nationalist point that Christianity is inherently egalitarian, that it erases ethnic difference, that it basically has created modern notions of multiculturalism and
there
globalism.
Is a sense, Christianity does have that multicultural sense, but it also recognizes within Christian society, differences of ability and gifting and so forth, right? So while your primary identity is no longer that you are Black or white or Dutch or American or Italian, right? So it doesn't necessarily maybe erase some of the ethnic characteristics that you might have. So yeah, let's say that certain people on a certain continent have a lower average IQ than most other continents, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay, that creates a reality, but you know what, though? You have a place within the Christian community, right? Because you and I share an identity that goes beyond the color of our skin or our IQ or whatever. You have a home in here, and we are all brothers in Christ. And so we are part of a unified society that transcends the other things that might be used to divide us, right? So, and that's the thing that people have to come back to, is that it's not just sort of like a liberal get along. Christianity has, in a sense, one of the terms that my profs used to use was narrative suicide. So you have a story that would define you, say the American story, or it might be the atheist story, the evolutionist, but in a sense, you're supposed to put that story to death to embrace the Christian story, right? So now the Christian, so you're given a new narrative, a new story, a new set of, and it's not just a set of beliefs, but you're given a whole, so you commit narrative suicide, you put to death the old narrative to take on a new narrative, which is the Christian story, right?
Right.
And that's really, I think, the thing that a lot of people overlook, is that we're not just in a process of, it's not like ethno-nationalism. It's like, no, being a Christian is more, your identity as a Christian is more important than your identity as American. And in fact, your identity as a Christian should actually, your loyalty should not be to America, but to Christ. Like, you're not, once you become a Christian, you're no longer, you're sort of an American or a Canadian, but not really. You're a Christian first. And that's, I think, where that's lost on a lot of people. And I think a lot of Americans struggle with that, because Americans,
like I was going to say, a lot of Americans have that.
They really start, and in part because the origins of the United States was wrapped up with the notion of religious freedom, right? Yeah. So we're here. This is, in a sense, of manifest destiny. This is the place where we're going to really be able to instantiate a Christian vision. And so for many, their perception that, well, America is the instantiation of Christian beliefs. And I think it might have been in certain contexts and in certain like colonies and communities, but at this point in time, it's really incumbent upon Christians to rediscover that they have an identity separate from their country, and that you are strangers and aliens in the land, kind of thing.
Yeah, but then I can understand like why that's inherently like shocking to a lot of people of this mindset. Yeah, but even like that whole like religious freedom thing has become like polluted and distorted by libs to like mean something else.
It has, and so there is on the right, there is a lot of work to be done. Yeah, and I'm getting more comfortable. That's part of the reason why I think, getting back to one of those questions you had earlier of stepping off of Twitter.
Yeah, what happened with that? Like, why did you decide
partly because I'm a man of prayer and faith. So I do faith, I do devotions, and I was watching myself
getting griped.
On Twitter, but it's sometimes what happens is Twitter takes its own dynamic. So I would find myself getting caught up in things, and because you're anonymous or whatever, that even for me, I was a little over the top. And I come back and I'd go like, and I know you've done it too. You delete tweets and stuff, and I would just like, I'm not really happy with it. And then I'm looking at like how much time it's taking. And every second I'm looking at my phone to see how many likes did I get or whatever. And I found, that's why I wrote that piece, being possessed by Twitter. And I really found that there was a hole. And I, sometimes I look at, like, I go to my phone now and I'll find myself looking for art, and like, there's nothing to read. There's no articles. Like, what am I going to do? So I've been working on my business. I've been spending more time in prayer, reading books. And here's the thing too. Like I did a thing in couples. Sometimes, generally, I've been usually the one that picked the TV shows that we watch, right? And you try to find things that both of us will like, but they're more guy-centric. A show that your wife will like, but you like more, kind of thing. But this time, I actually let my wife pick what we're watching, and so.
Whoa.
Oh, I know. So
beta.
Jesse
Lee Peterson beta.
She picked Grey's Anatomy.
So we have
18 seasons, Gio. We have been binge watching Grey's Anatomy. But so as a person with a fairly fixed belief system, you're watching and you're looking. I'm watching. So I've been sitting down with my wife watching a couple episodes of Grey's Anatomy. I have time for that now that I'm not on Twitter, right? But it has been instructive for me, because I don't usually watch a whole lot of TV, but the degree to which a show like Grey's Anatomy is an indoctrination system into a progressive world.
Medical show's the worst, by the way. Yeah.
Well, and in a sense, like too, we're 7 seasons in now, and there has not been a single priest or pastor to give, like no priest or pastor has ever come in to visit a patient ever.
Yeah.
7 seasons. And you're like, huh. The only stable couple is a lesbian couple. They're the, you know what I mean? And you're just like,
even like early 2000s Grey's Anatomy was, like,
yeah, it was, oh yeah. Like you could see, like, it was like, oh, okay. They were telling us what was coming anyways. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Medical shows. I have a video, when I used to do standalone videos, like, maybe I'll go back to it, but like, on medical shows. Cause me and my parents, this was like during, we binged like a bunch of these Australian shows, and one of them was called All Saints. It was like, it's Australian daytime television. It was great. It was like one of the few like good medical shows.
Yeah.
And then you like see the evolution from that to like House to then now you have like my mother would watch these ones, like the new ones, like New Amsterdam, and it's like totally like in your face sexual revolution, like you name it, like no like even recognition. Like the thing is with House, like in the early, like the mid 2000s, you still had like the tussling with an older Christian order, even though that was getting bodied. But these new ones, man.
Yeah, but there was that one whole thing though too, where the one girl comes out, the one lady comes out as gay to her. I think they were from like Latin tradition, right? So
yeah,
like Spanish, right? And they brought the priest in to try to convert her away from her lesbianism. They have this argument of like where she's quoting scripture and he's quoting scripture, and you're like, oh my word! I just like, and this is where I said like,
this is where things are heading back.
And I'm like, yeah, and I'm like, oh my word! And like, so we had to actually turn it off because one of the kids was watching, and I'm like, okay, you do have to understand how this woman is abusing scripture to make her point, and that like this is a really almost demonic subtle twisting. And I said, like, you as a 14-year-old can't see this yet because you just don't have, like, Mom and I can walk through this, and we're kind of immune to this now. We can kind of watch the show without being indoctrinated. But I'm not so sure that you at 14 haven't, just after watching this episode with us today, we need to
immediately going to go and read an ebook of the God delusion, like every 14-year-old edgy,
like school. We need to go and deprogram you now, because this, like, she has completely twisted the word around to make it sound like if you oppose homosexuality, you're basically like a nasty type of Christian. But good Christians, they're all in favor of Christians who really follow the true loving Christ. They're all in favor of gay marriage.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You know, and you're like, no. We got to get your head straight, girl. This is not, like, okay, so let's have a chat.
But but it's funny though about like the medical dramas. I feel like I said this in my video, like they have a source to the self as like a medicalized subject, and that's why they can push all sorts of lurid propaganda. But about Twitter, like one thing I observed, and maybe like this is my own like critiquing myself, is I feel like Twitter is the reason it's such a time sink, and the reason like I constantly look at my phone, even like right now as we're recording, is because like if you're like I hate this term, but if you're like a content creator, if you're like doing any sort of intellectual work, or like pseudo intellectual work, is it more accurately, I feel like it's certainly like it's not the same time waste as like other social media like Facebook or whatever, because it gives you the illusion that you are doing productive intellectual work by engaging in the discourse, and therefore you don't feel guilty of the fact that it is like largely escapism. And so that's why it sucks you in as a more of like a creator type of person. It sucks you in because it gives you the illusion that you're doing work while you're escaping.
And there is this whole like, when you're doing it and you're doing it well and you're succeeding at it, right? And I was right on the cusp of getting big, right?
Yeah, you were. Yeah.
The bigger you get, the more it consumes you, right?
Yes. Yeah. Because you feel obligated.
One of the things I do miss though is that feeling that you're in the flow of all the
I talk about this, brother. Yes.
And I'm like, and there's moments where like, okay, how do I get in the flow? And I'm like, no. You don't need to be in the. But I think one of the things, and I think conservatives and the right struggle with this, and I think this is one of the reasons, like the ancillaries, is that is working on like real world stuff. So the left's use of Twitter They have all of the networks in the university.
Oh yeah, those
in the
Twitter, it's wild. Yeah,
all the NGOs. So they have real world networks, activists, whatever. So when they're doing Twitter is an overlay on their news media, their activists, their university, their think tanks, all of that network of stuff. Twitter is the overlay, and it's like the spider web hub that it just basically gives jet fuel to all the things that they're already doing in the real world. Okay. Yeah. So for us as conservatives,
we're posters. Yeah.
We don't have that real world network because we can't, because you can't build that. I mean, there's some politics and stuff, but you can't build in order to do, if you were to do that at this level, with this level of publicity, you would get stepped on so fast, right? Like the Tony Dungy thing this week, or that Provorov or whatever, right? You do this with any series at that kind of level of public eye, you would be stepped on so hard. So, and we recognize it. So we're not really, I mean, other than a few people, like again, Charles Hayward is starting to do some of this, Anton, the guys at IM 1776, they're building some real world networks underneath.
Yeah.
All of it, right? But they're tiny comparatively, right? So the vast majority of what happens on the right it's all ethereal.
Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast, where every Wednesday there are interesting guests, amazing ideas, solo streams, and discussions on a diverse array of topics from art, philosophy, history, and more. The free version will be available both here on YouTube and as a downloadable link on Anchor and Spotify, as well as on Substack. Each week, the full, uncensored, and spicier version will now be available on both Patreon and Substack, where you will have access to the full archive of both Content Minded and of Giant Reviews, where I break down interesting texts every week, including other exciting paywalled articles and good content. Thank you all. Please like, share, and subscribe. God bless. Goodbye. Help keep the content renaissance alive. Too sweet.